So just waiting another minute, and then we're going to get started. So I want to welcome everybody tonight, and so glad that you were able to join us. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Hindy Zeifman Stegman, and I am the founder of the Art of Empowerment, which is 501c3. And our mission is to show how we can turn pain into action, tears into growth, in order to experience the richness and transformational effect of our Jewish legacy. We are the children who were not to be born. However, our parents miraculously survived. As the first generation, second generation born after the Shoah, we are our parents' jewels and the jewels of our Jewish community. So what does this mean? We are our parents' treasures, and through our parents' stories and silences, we bonded, and we are bonded by memories whose echoes permeate our consciousness. We've been polished, admired, and overly protected. This status has been a burden, a responsibility, an obligation, and a privilege. And each of us has extraordinary strengths and courage. And as children, we heard and felt and were surrounded by our parents' stories. Whether they chose to discuss their wartime experiences with us or not, we remain influenced by their lives, because we cannot help being affected, whether epigenetically or in some other way, by our parents' past experiences and their behavior. We find ourselves carrying the echoes of their voices in our daily activities. The message about life we received from our parents was unique because their experiences were unique. Discovering how we are affected by the trauma of the Holocaust is step one. But then what? As we acknowledge and accept, forgive and let go, we're free to live a healthy, joyous, and joy-filled life. So tonight, I'm really excited to welcome a fellow 2G, someone who is here to honor his father, Joel Poremba. And Joel wrote an amazing book called My Name is Stasek. I hope I spelled the sound.
Stasek Serdell.
Okay, there you go. That was his name. And he's going to explain to us about his father's victimhood to victory and how we 2Gs deal with the heaped on effect from our survivor parents. So welcome, Joel.
Thank you, Hindy, and thank you to the Art of Empowerment for having me.
Thank you. So Joel, let's start off with, by the way, I loved reading the book that you wrote on your father. And for all of you that haven't had the opportunity, please get Joel's book. It's a very easy read, but there were so many aha moments for me that I could totally relate. It was a great read. So Joel, what was the impact of your father's survival had on you as a child?
At the outset, I felt I had a responsibility to tell my father's story. My father by nature was very shy, didn't like groups or in crowds. He raised two sons that were outspoken and had a lot of energy. And as the eldest son, early on, I recognized that I had a certain duty. My father didn't talk about his survival. He didn't talk about his story. He didn't talk about his family. And I didn't really understand why at an early age, other than something bad must have happened. And then maybe by the time I was 6 or 7, I understood that many, many Jews were murdered. But it wasn't until my bar mitzvah speech, when I gave my Devar Torah, I boldly told the congregation that one day I would tell my father's story. Of course, I had no idea what that would entail and what emotional ups and downs I was going to go through to be able to do that. But just to clear up, that the name Stashik Sordell was the false papers that my father had for the last 3 years of the war, and he played the role of a Pole when he was hiding on a farm.
Wonderful. So tell us, where are you in the birth order within your family, and do you have any siblings?
I'm the eldest of 2 sons, and just have the one younger brother, 2 years younger than me.
And so did your younger brother take on the same, I don't want to use the word burden, responsibility?
No, the 2 of us are very different in approaching various issues, but I think from an early age on, I tended to be the more verbal one about this. I was the one who pursued my father for almost 31 years in the house, asking what happened, what did you go through, what was it like? My brother supported me, but he didn't take that role on, trying to play detective and chase my dad around. So no, but he knew that one day I would do this, but he wasn't going to engage my dad along those lines like I did early on.
You know, it's interesting. There's a book that I read many years ago. It was called Memorial Candles by, I think her name was Dina Wardy. And it seemed that in most families, there was generally one, could be more than one, but generally one that took on that role. And very often it was the eldest in my family. I'm the oldest also, the only girl. I have 3 brothers. And yeah, I always felt it was kind of my responsibility. So for those of you listening, I'm just wondering, think to yourself, where are you in your birth order? And was there only one in your family as well? So let's talk a little bit about something that we're all familiar with, survivor guilt. What does that mean to you?
Well, almost every single survivor had the guilt, why me? In most survivors' cases, most, if not their entire family, had been wiped out. Most, if not their entire extended family and their friends had been murdered. So you end up asking your question, why was I selected? Why is it that I zigged and zagged in this order and survived and they didn't, when they had more connections, they had more money, they had cars, they had ways to get out, and I had less? How did I survive? For me, it became an instance of, why is it that I was even born? Because intellectually speaking, if there's no Holocaust, I feel like, I would not be here. Poland was the arguable center of the Jewish world in the 1920s and 30s. Warsaw, or at least Krakow, was known as Jerusalem North, affectionately. How many Polish Jews left for Canada and the United States? Hardly any in the 20s and the 30s. There was really no reason to leave. Yes, there was a lot of anti-Semitism, but it really was the center of the Jewish world. The Holocaust comes, survivors almost all Poles left, and if it wasn't for my dad leaving, if it wasn't for the Holocaust, my mother and my father would not have met, and I'm the exact product of that. So I carried around that burden for probably 50 years before I actually articulated that to my rabbi, Rabbi Yisrael Senior, and he said, you, Joel, are not the product of a tragedy. You are the product of your father's triumph. And as simple as a line as that was, it really changed my direction and my point of view. And that led to me eventually watching my father's 4-hour Shoah interview that I had put on the shelf for 21 years and couldn't watch, and then led me to sit down with him further, interview him, and then write this memoir. So as the 2G, I think we're all in the same position of why us, our parents, it's why did we survive? But I think that trauma was definitely passed down through no fault of any of us.
You know, something really interesting I want to share. Years ago, I went to a 2G conference, and the keynote speaker was Elie Wiesel. And I'll never forget, as I was sitting there, I always knew my parents were the victim. I never thought of myself as a victim, ever. And Elie Wiesel said, you, the children, were Hitler's target. You, the children, were never supposed to be born. Your parents were already alive, but you, the children, were his target. Oh my God. When I heard that, I went, who's he talking about? Me? I never thought of myself as me being the victim. So from that moment on, I looked at things totally differently because we were Hitler's victim.
Correct, because if he had succeeded and wiped out all European Jewry, which he pledged to do in January of 1939, we would not have been here had he been successful. So that is correct. We were the target.
And so our children, our grandchildren, we are here. We definitely are here. And I always like to end with, I'm Yisrael Chai, but I think I'm going to say it right now. We're here and I'm Yisrael Chai. So tell me, again, why was it important for you to write the book?
I've always been aware of Polish whitewashing of history. It's well known that the Poles were complicit with the Germans upon invasion, both at the local, municipal, law enforcement level, and even on the neighbor level. The Polish government might have been in exile, but those Poles that stayed behind and formed the occupied Polish government certainly helped the Germans round up Jews. And that's exactly what happened in my father's town and to my grandfather. I've always been charged up to combat and rebut those whitewashings of history, which has continued for almost 80 years and has recently culminated in Israel recalling its ambassador to Poland over the criminalization of speech in Poland that equates Polish complicity with Nazi involvement. So that's always been there to gin me up. But after I was able to sit down and watch my father's video, which again took 21 years for me to watch, there was nowhere else to go. There was nothing else to do but to finally put this down in writing and memorialize my father, who bore witness to Polish complicity and, of course, the Nazi genocide.
So growing up, did your father speak about his experience of the Holocaust?
No. So for 31 years, no, he never said a word. We had a picture up in the house of my father's family, which he recovered after the war when he returned to his family home. And often I would point at everyone, who are they? Where are they? Why are they not here? And just very generically, my dad would say they were murdered in Europe by the Germans. And that would be the end of it. When the movie Schindler's List came out, he finally gave away a few details about his own life, but he caught himself because he really didn't want to go there and open up an entire box. But the Shoah Foundation was created as a result of the movie's success, and 6 years later, my dad booked a time to be interviewed. So while that interview was going on over the course of 7 hours, due to being restless, I poked my head out twice, and I heard him disclose 2 different incidents that I had never heard before. And as liberating as the experience was for my father, after finally talking about everything for 53 years, he was all loosey-goosey and wanted to talk about his experience. And I completely shut down because of the 2 things that I had heard. I had never heard my father emote or share any kind of detail of pain and suffering and loss. And the 2 things that I heard really paralyzed me. And so then the shoe was on the other foot. He chased me around for 21 years before I was settled enough to be able to sit down and watch it and hear it all. And I
You know,
share those two things that I heard in the book.
interestingly enough, when my mother also did her story for the Shoah Foundation, and I'll never forget, she got all dressed up. You would think she was going to a cocktail party, and had her hair done and makeup. And she just felt it was so important to look good. Again, not as a victim, to look victorious. And she really felt so grateful, I guess, for the opportunity to speak. And I think I listened to it and I can't even remember anymore right after. But you know what? It's been how many years since the Shoah Foundation did those
The mid-90s.
in the mid-90s. I think it was about 10 years ago that I found it and played it for my grandkids. And that was such a gift. So as much as it was so helpful for them to finally speak, right? What a gift that we have that for our children and grandchildren, right?
Yeah, my father dressed up as well. I think he wanted to look his best too. But it was a pretty difficult interview. He pretty much cried through the entire thing, and it was very, very difficult to watch. But it had to be done, and I've since shared it with both of my children as well.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, my mom went into a deep depression afterwards. She got it all out, and then I don't know, it took her like a few months after she did that testimony. So I know a lot of people hesitated. They weren't ready. So kudos to our folks.
Yeah, my father had a small group of Holocaust survivors, all from Poland in LA. And when the foundation came out, they all said, no way. And slowly, one by one, they began doing it. And my dad was the last one. And I didn't think there was going to be any way that he would do it, because he was pretty set that he wasn't going to do it. And at our son's bris, he came up to me, and that was in August 98. He said, I want you to know I booked a date. They're coming to the house in October. I was shocked, but I was completely certain that he would cancel it because it had been so difficult to get to that point. But he didn't, and they came, and he was ready to talk. And he was upbeat and very loose, as I said earlier. Afterwards, all he wanted to do was talk. But now I was traumatized, and I couldn't hear. So it unfortunately took us another 21 years before I could face him. But it's all down in a book now.
As you're speaking, it brings to mind that for so many of us, we didn't ask. We were scared to ask. Maybe we were scared to hear the answer or to upset our parents. And now, unfortunately, most of them are gone. And I myself have said, if only, why didn't I? And sometimes I spend so much energy on all the wonderful things, all the gifts from my parents, but there's always still that little bit of regret. Why didn't I? Why didn't I ask? Why didn't I know more?
Yeah, I took a passive approach as well. What I would do is I watched hundreds, if not thousands of hours of documentaries and Holocaust dramas and interviews. And I would put it on TV to try to bait my father to sit down and relate something, say something. And I was too afraid to say anything. So I let the TV do the talking, which wasn't sufficient. And never once would he bite. And yet the program would be over and I wouldn't say anything either. It was too difficult to go into.
So in your book, share with us a little bit of some of the takeaways from your book.
So early on, my father was 9 years old, and he had already seen a great deal of anti-Semitism in his town, Velichka, which was southeast, about 8 miles from Krakow, a town of 8,000 people, half of which were Jewish. It was a pretty religiously Jewish city. There were constant attacks on Jews, physically, emotionally, through business, in the courts. My grandfather got into a fight with a national wrestle champion. My grandfather drove a bus, and the wrestler refused to pay the bus fare and called him a Jew boy and a dog and a rat. And my grandfather got into a fight with him, and long story short, he ended up losing his bus driver's license because the city took the side of the well-known wrestler. There were many incidents like that my father witnessed, and in every occasion, my grandfather stood up to the anti-Semitism. But once the Germans rolled into their town on September 7th, everything changed. The daily rituals of rounding up Jews and making them sweep the center square evolved into picking up 32 men, taking them to the forest and shooting them, one of which was my grandfather. From that point forward, my father absolutely lost any kind of trust, if there was any trust, in anything that the Germans ordered. If they said you had to go help build the local barracks at the Prussia labor camp, my father wouldn't go. My father wouldn't wear the Jewish armband, which was required by law by November of 1939. My father was able to get away with this because he was short, he had blonde hair at that time, and he had blue eyes. And many Jews from Krakow were populating his town, so it was easy for him to blend in without wearing the armband. People had no idea who he was. And he ended up doing that for the first 2.5, 3 years of the war, sneaking around, obtaining food. People didn't recognize him until 1942 rolled around, and unbeknownst to us at the time, with the Wannsee Conference, all the rumors were going around about roundups, liquidations, deportations. My father he was 12 then, went to his mother and said, "I'm leaving." And he just walked out of the house with his youngest sister, leaving his mother and 3 other sisters behind. And he didn't have a plan. He ended up going back and forth, tic-tac-toeing between 3 or 4 ghettos. And eventually he ran out of options because every ghetto was being liquidated. And he was able to come across false papers, and he took on the name Stashik Serdel, which was a little boy that had been murdered during the German invasion. And from there, he snuck in and out of the Krakow ghetto under the cover of the Schindler Jews, except no one knew who they were at the time. And he eventually wound up on a farm hiding there for the last 2.5, 3 years of the war, posing as a Pole, pretending like he knew how to run a dairy farm. But it ended up being about a mile away from a German outpost, which was a fort that had been built in World War I by the Germans and repopulated during World War II. And he had to deliver dairy products to them every single day. So here he thought he was running away from the city where the Gestapo was, and he thought he'd be safer out in the country. And sure enough, there he was delivering milk to the German soldiers. So this went on for almost 6 years in total. And then the Soviets, actually the front line was right there in Velichka, and he witnessed the Soviets push the Germans right back, and they kept retreating west, and it was 1945.
You know, every single survivor has an amazing story. And for so many, when I read the book on how your father just had this feeling that he couldn't stay. He couldn't stay. He had to run. My father also told the story. He was orphaned at 3 and raised by his grandparents. And when they were rounding people up to go to the ghetto, he was from Poland, from a little village called Stopnica. He said he couldn't stay. Something wouldn't allow him to go with his family. Why? why. He didn't know why. He just knew that he had to run. He had to run. And so for so many of us, it's amazing that we sometimes don't pay attention when we hear the message, right? Run, stay, do. We follow. We're followers very often. And a lot of those followers did not survive. So we were talking the other day, Joel, about being vigilant as two G's and as Jews to what's going on in the world, and listening and trusting our gut as well, right?
Yeah, you're right. Uncanny as it was, from age 9 to 15, my dad had a bizarre sense of when trouble was around the corner. For every ghetto that he snuck into, he knew to leave before it was liquidated. And when he would end up in another ghetto after it had been liquidated, he always seemed to know when to leave that ghetto. He worked in a leather shop and the Gestapo had visited. And after one visit, he knew to leave and never come back. And you're right. There was no roadmap or formula to survival versus being caught and being gassed. It was just, I don't know if you want to call it luck, but the circumstances were the way they were. I mean, many people did more than my father and didn't survive, and some people did way less and didn't survive. It just never made it much sense to really rationalize. But my father always seemed to know, just like yours, when something was not to be trusted, he just wouldn't.
Well, I think that's why so many survivors did have this survivor's guilt. Why me? Was I smarter? Did I do more mitzvahs? Why me? And I think that survivor's guilt, for some of us, I can only speak for me, was sort of passed down in a way that I don't think I was as free to be just light and fun and silly. There was always an energy there, which I never realized, because I'm a happy-go-lucky kind of person. I like to have fun, and I'm really easygoing. But when I think about comparing myself to some of my friends that are non-2Gs, whose parents were not Holocaust survivors, they just experienced more of I want to say unlimited joy or a freedom, that somehow there was always something there that stopped me. It didn't stop me from having fun, but maybe too much fun. I don't know.
Yeah, for me growing up, because I think my father was a survivor, it was always, shh, don't advertise you're Jewish. For Jewish holidays, don't wear your kippah or talis in the car or walking to shul. Don't advertise, keep it on the down low. And that came from my father because that's all he knew for 6 years during the Holocaust. So unfortunately, I think that defensiveness was put on my brother and I just because that seemed to work for him for 6 years, incognito with false papers. But ironically, my wife and I sent our 2 kids to Hebrew day school, just like my father sent us. And their approach is much different. It's much more open, much more freer and unlimited and not restrained, and with much more pride, without having to stifle yourself. And I never really talked about it with my kids, but my brother and I were expected to be a little more quaint and quiet about it. And thank God today's generation is taught just the opposite, to be much more proud and vigilant. So
yes, that's true. However, look what's going on in the universities in North America today.
yeah,
Jewish kids are now scared to wear yarmulkes, scared to wear their Magen Davids. Parents are telling their children, don't walk around where people can realize that you're Jewish. What is that all about? So
Yeah,
we went from our generation, then there was the next generation, and now we're going backwards.
yeah, unfortunately, there's an element in North American campuses that is highly anti-Semitic and probably has been since the 60s, and it's gotten progressively worse. And you're right, it's almost come 360 from the way, because it wasn't like that when I was in college in the 80s, but it's probably been like that for 25 years. The way we just described it, it's bad. You're not allowed to openly celebrate anything in the quad with your own booth or kiosk like other groups or in other religions and other niches. And if you do put up the Star of David and advertise it's Passover, you're going to take heat, verbal and physical heat for it. You're correct.
So I think, for me, the word is vigilant also. I think today we need to be vigilant. And as much as we always say, and I'm not one of these people that walk around with doom and gloom, I'm a very positive person. And in the past, I would have said this could never happen again, certainly not in North America. We're safe here, right? But thank God we have Israel who's got our back.
Yeah, part of the problem is only 18 states have mandatory K through 12 Holocaust education. And that's pretty outrageous in the United States. The Holocaust has been scrubbed from public school history books in England. There's been parades in Spain and in the Nordic countries celebrating the Holocaust with floats of the crematoria and actors dressed in blue and white pinstriped uniforms. It's hard to imagine where we are now over the last 20 years when this probably would have all been unheard of immediately after the Holocaust. It seems like the world got a little more of an inkling with the trial of Eichmann, but that's been forgotten, it seems. And today's generations either don't believe it ever happened or believe that the number 6 million has been exaggerated. And the list of hoaxes that are on social media is enough to fill up a whole chat room. I mean, it's outrageous.
Well, that's why I think that the slogan "Never Forget" is so important. And what we're doing here tonight, I believe, is so important. And you writing your book about your father's story is so important because we do need to share. It's important to remember. It's important, I always say, to turn our pain into purpose. We need to make a difference in this world, remembering the past, healing the present, so that we can have a wonderful future for ourselves and our children. I think getting stuck, as some people are, in the sadness of never forgiving, never letting go, holding on to the pain, holding on to the suffering and the anger, keeps us a prisoner. Keeps us a prisoner.
Yeah, it does. And what people have to know is that most survivors, if not all survivors, married, had children, their children have had children. In our instance, my parents sent my brother and I to Hebrew day school from kindergarten through 9th grade. My wife and I did the same with our 2 children. They've had Torah Talmud educations and they're fluent in Hebrew. And that's my dad's legacy. Some of the photos that I have of the roundups in my father's town in September 1939, they almost look like what you see more modernly in New York and New Jersey with observant Orthodox Jews being attacked because they're easily identifiable. Unfortunately, it looks the same.
Well, let's Let's pray for a beautiful world for our children, for our grandchildren. Joel, is there anything that you want to leave us with?
My father, the key to my father's survival, which forms the basis of the book, was his resilience, his resistance. Unlike being a part of an armed resistance movement, my dad was able to survive by staying on the run, by being resourceful. Most of the time it was the plan of a boy. And maybe it was that kind of innocence and lack of expertise that made him so unidentifiable and so he attracted no attention. So that I think the simplicity of wanting to stay alive from day to day, to find out if his parents survived or not, to find out if he could find his sisters. He lost over almost 250 members of my grandfather's side of the family, and almost all of dozens on my grandmother's side. And yet he would not give up, he would not give in, he wouldn't follow any of the Polish orders or the Nazi laws. And his goal was to just make it to the next day. And I think that kind of vigilance is exactly what we need when facing trying times as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And for all those that are listening, thank you for joining us tonight. I have planned to do one webinar a month with different guests. So it would be the third Wednesday of the month of February, but the liberation of Auschwitz comes up on I think it's the 27th of this month. And so I've decided to do a webinar on the 30th. So stay tuned for that with a wonderful educator. And her mom and my mom were both liberated from Auschwitz. Joel, are you want to share in the chat your information?
Yeah, I put in my author website. There's a lot of information on how my dad survived, and I share almost every single photograph from the book on the website as well. And there's a link to purchase it on Amazon as well.
Okay, so for those people that signed up, they did get a link to the book. You want to tell us what your website is?
It's just joelporemba.com.
Okay, well, that's great. Can you post it again? Somebody is saying.
They might not be able to see. They might need clearance from you, I'm guessing, maybe. Oh,
okay. Okay, everyone. Does anybody have any questions actually just before we go? Do you want to put it in the chat? I was going to end it now, but you know what? We're going to be loosey-goosey tonight. So if there's any questions. So somebody says, thank you, Hindy and Joel. I could relate to every word and feeling you shared as 2G. All right. Susie Wood. Thank you, Susie. If there's any questions, Joel and I will be happy to answer. We'll give it another second. Okie doke, then we'll close it off for the night. Again, oh, Michael Straub has his hand up. Michael, can you put your question in the chat?
Or you could speak it.
Okay, you want to unmute?
I just want to say my father fought in the Russian partisans. He was from Poland originally. He also fled when he realized that what was coming. And like usual, he rarely spoke about anything that happened But I can tell you a story about when I encountered anti-Semitism if you're interested in hearing it.
I think we're going to try to keep it very narrow
No
and
problem.
just
Okay.
answer questions, if that's okay. And I'm sure if you want to send it to me, I'd be happy to share it.
Okay, you mean right now?
Send it to me as an email.
Okay, very good. I will do that.
Okay.
Yeah, what's interesting about what Michael said is not many Poles fled to the east, but some did. And of course, I mean, his father's experience sounds very similar to one of the Bielski brothers that ended up joining a Russian partisan group as well.
Yeah, the Russian experience for so many was actually not an easy experience either.
Well, there's a comment there that about the rabbis telling the local Jewish population that things would be okay. I actually mentioned that in the book. My father had made the same statement to me. I can't get in the mind of Polish rabbis during the Holocaust that were still maintaining underground shuls, but they did try to keep calm and give people hope. And by and large, most of them did do just that by saying, everything will be okay. The Germans aren't that bad. But no one really knew what the final solution was. Obviously, that was not, it's talked about so openly today, but people don't know. It was a secret order and a secret meeting. So I don't necessarily fault the rabbis at the time for saying that things would be okay.
Well, I think it was beyond the scope of what anybody could believe. You know, it was beyond the scope of what anybody could believe.
No, it had never been done in history, the planned elimination of an entire people. So how could you foresee it? You know, that certainly the rhetoric was pretty harsh in Mein Kampf and much worse in the 30s out of Germany, but it's one no one could have foreseen exactly all
No,
that happening.
we can only learn from history. We can't go back and
Yeah, I think what we
whatever.
learned is when someone says that they want to destroy the Jews, they mean it. That's the takeaway.
That's right. That's right. All right. So thank you again, Joel. That was really great. And if anybody would like to join my Facebook group, I'm going to send an email out with the link, and it'll be a private group so we can share, because I think sharing is so important. You get to understand that, you know, your story is my story and my story is his story, and we can learn from each other. And especially right now, what I'm finding for so many of us is that with this pause or lockdown or whatever you want to call it, this sense of isolation and is really affecting a lot of, I find a lot of 2Gs especially. So if anybody is experiencing anything, I'd love for you to join the Facebook group. It'll be a private group. We can really connect with each other and share and have a voice. All right. So
Thanks again, Hindy.
okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.